Well, I'm Filipe. I'm the Executive Director of Mário Soares and Maria Barroso Foundation, and on behalf of the entire team, and particularly from the Portuguese delegation here, I would like to begin by warmly greeting all of you. I would also like to extend our sincere thanks to our Austrian hosts, particularly to Stefan, to Foster team, and also Bruno Kreisky Forum for this excellent organization and for welcoming us so generously here in Vienna, also with nice weather, like in Portuguese weather, and the sun is so warm for us. Let me start with a brief introduction to our institution. Mário Soares and Maria Barroso Foundation is a private institution with public interest created by Mário Soares himself in 1991, created to preserve, study and promote the legacy of two leading figures of Portuguese democracy, Mário Soares and Maria Barroso. We are a space of culture, as Mário Soares would say, culture in a double sense. On the one hand, linked to the preservation of the memory and the history of the struggle for freedom and democracy in Portugal through personal archives and collections. On the other side, because it aims to promote a civic and democratic culture inspired by the life and the legacy and values of Soares and Barroso. Let me switch. Mário Soares and Maria Barroso. It's nice to have a face from them. The foundation houses one of the most important historical archives in Portugal. It contains millions of documents, photographs, personal collections, letters, newspapers, and audiovisual materials that document the country's transition from dictatorship to democracy, the decolonization process, the path to European integration, and also a lot of other topics that you can see in this slide. Let me also say a word about Mário Soares and Maria Barroso. Mário Soares is probably the face of democratic Portugal. When the Portuguese Revolution of 1974 took place, Soares had already traveled a long way in his opposition to the Portuguese dictatorship. He had been arrested 12 times, deported to the island of São Tomé and Príncipe, and forced into exile in France. He had founded the Socialist Party and had a political project for the country based on democratic socialism. His career during the period of democracy is probably a familiar one, with most notable positions at national level being Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Prime Minister, and President of the Republic for 2 terms, and internationally as a member of European Parliament, Vice President of Socialist International, President of the European Movement, just to give you some examples. Maria Barroso, his lifelong companion, was an equally remarkable figure. She was an educator, a theater and cinema actress, a profession she was banned from pursuing under dictatorship, a member of Portuguese Parliament, and one of the first women in Portugal to engage actively in public life. And finally, our delegation to this event, bringing together students, researchers, archivists, and civic actors committed to defending democratic values today. On 6th of March of 1974, in an article in French newspaper Le Monde, Mário Soares, who was then in exile in France, wrote, and I quote, "Something is finally happening in Portugal." 1 month later, on the 25th of April, the armed forces movement overthrew 48 years of dictatorship, and the Portuguese people took the streets shouting, singing, and hugging each other in euphoria. A great Portugal, the mark of one of the longest-lasting dictatorship in Europe, was transformed on that first day whole and clean, eternalized in the written words of the Portuguese poet Sofia de Melbreiner Anderson. The military coup that overthrew the dictatorship of Salazar and then Marcelo Caetano restored freedom to Portugal and Portuguese people, and at the same time began a process of democratization that has led to political change in several countries. To understand the Portuguese contribution to the FREI project, I invite you to briefly visit our unique democratic journey. Unlike most European countries, Portugal transitioned from dictatorship to democracy through a peaceful military coup, the Carnation Revolution. This moment ended Estado Novo, the new state dictatorship. It also marked the beginning of the decolonization of 5 African countries, and the revolution opened the path to the free elections, the adoption of a new democratic constitution in 1976, and eventually Portugal integration into the European communities in 1986. Let me take you back for a moment. Say in the streets what you say at home was a phrase painted on the walls of the United Democratic Electoral Commission headquarters, a coalition of non-communist movements led by Mário Soares that stood for the 1969 elections under the dictatorship. This simple sentence powerfully captured what it meant to live under the Estado Novo dictatorship, a regime where fear was institutionalized and shaped the very exercise of citizenship across all areas of life. At that time, we could not say in the street what we said at home. We could not do in the street what we did at home. And in many ways, we could not even think in the street what we thought at home. Portugal was ruled by an authoritarian regime for 48 years, as I said before. This period began with a military coup in 1926, culminated in Estado Novo, established in 1933 under António Oliveira Salazar, the dictator. You can see also for the Italian colleagues the picture of Mussolini in the Salazar's desk. The Estado Novo was marked by censorship, political repression, colonial war, and the systematic exclusion of large sectors of population from political, social, and cultural life. The regime was authoritarian, corporatist, and ideological, inspired by European fascism. It was based on a supposed balance of economic, social, and moral order, anchored in 3 main pillars of legitimacy. First, the armed forces, then the Catholic Church, and the political police. The regime relied heavily on ideological narratives, and I brought 2 of them. God, nation, and family, the regime's slogan, embodied into the notion of the idealized Portuguese home, a domesticated, obedient, and patriarchal society. Also states in the Salazar words, Portugal is a country of gentle manners. And another one, Portugal is not a small country. This doctrine promoted the myth of a pluricontinental and multiracial and indivisible empire stretching from Minho in the north of Portugal to East Timor in the East Asia. Until the early 1950s, Estado Novo, the Portuguese dictatorship, promoted an openly racist colonial policy rooted in the myth of the Age of Discoveries as a glorious epic, also the white superiority, social Darwinism, and the belief in a civilizing mission, and the legitimization of forced labor and indigenous status, which denied African subjects citizenship rights. From the 50s onwards, Salazar regime gradually adopted, and forced by United Nations, for instance, adopted and internationalized the concept of Lusotropicalism, a theory which claimed that the Portuguese were naturally more tolerant, less racist, and more capable of forming harmonious relations with other peoples. In 1969, after Salazar's incapacitation, Marcelo Caetano succeeded him as head of government. He attempted to initiate limited reforms, a period referred to as Marcelist Spring. These efforts included some cosmetic liberalization of the press and limited political changes, openings, but none of these reforms questioned the core of the regime. Political prisoners remain in jail. Colonial wars continued in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea, for instance. The political police remain active, and real democratic freedoms, association, expression, vote, were still denied. The failure of this so-called liberalization further deepened internal discontent and exposed the regime incapacity to reform itself from within. Then, on 25th April 1974, a group of low-ranking military officers, known as the Armed Forces Movement, carried out a peaceful coup that became known as Carnation Revolution. It was a moment of extraordinary civic mobilization. People took the streets, not with violence, but with red carnations, a flower, a symbol of peace and hope. What followed the revolution was not a return to normality, but a period of intense political, social, and cultural transformation known as the revolutionary process in progress. At the core of this process was the program of the Armed Forces Movement, which outlined three fundamental and interconnected goals known as the 3Ds: democratize, decolonize, and develop. Between April 1974 and the end of 1975, Portugal experienced one of the most dynamic and turbulent democratic openings in post-war Europe. This period was marked by the emergence of dozens of political parties, trade unions, and civic organizations, a surge in social movements in streets, in factories, in rural areas, demanding rights, housing, land reform, and social justice, the occupation of land, the massive return of over 500,000 people from former colonies, the so-called returnees. These are some of the pictures. And the Portuguese Revolution quickly became a source of fascination across Europe and beyond. Foreign journalists, filmmakers, intellectuals, and activists came to Portugal, some to observe and many to participate. Figures from across political spectrum were inspired by what they saw as a living laboratory of democracy. And this process, revolution, culminated in April 76 with the approval of a new democratic constitution, which remains in force to this day with several amendments. 3 weeks later, the Socialist Party, led by Mário Soares, won the first legislative elections, forming Portugal's first constitutional government. In parallel with its internal transformation, Portugal began to redefine its international orientation. The democratic project, championed above all by Mário Soares, came to be seen as inseparable from the European project. This slogan, Europe with us, coined by Mário Soares during the 76 election campaign, expressed this vision clearly. And people like Willy Brandt, Kreisky, Mitterrand, Filipe González came to Portugal to express their support to this vision towards democratic socialism and European integration. Portugal's application for accession to the European communities was formally accepted in 1976. The formal negotiations began in the next year, 1978, a process that included Spain, since it was decided that both countries should join the European communities simultaneously. But the path to the accession was long and demanding. The years that followed were marked by significant political instability, 9 governments in 10 years, 2 financial assistance programs by the IMF in 1977 and again in 1981, a long process of economic restructuring, and the consolidation of democratic institutions, including the constitutional revision in 1982, which removed definitely the military's institutional role in Portugal. Finally, in 1985, Mário Soares, as Prime Minister, signed the Treaty of Accession to the European Community in Lisbon, and this act closed the historical cycle from proudly alone, as Salazar once proclaimed, to proudly together. The Portuguese path to the FREI project brings us to our contribution to this project, which we have titled Unarchiving Democracy, Youth, Post-Colonial Memory and the Portuguese Democratic Path. The thematic focus guiding our participation in the project seeks to articulate 3 dimensions: the historical memory of resistance and democratic transition in Portugal, the Portuguese national specificity, a peaceful revolution and the process of decolonization, and contemporary challenges to democracy, including structural racism, post-colonial inequalities, and the rise of the far right. Why unarchiving? Because archives are not just places to preserve the past, they are tools to interrogate it, Archiving means power. The archive is not a neutral act, it's an act of resistance. And by unarchiving democracy, we seek to bring forward the silenced stories, the contests, narratives, and the memories that were pushed to the margins. Our main target group is young people aged 18 to 29, particularly those from post-colonial backgrounds, especially Lusophone African communities. These youth often face multiple forms of exclusion, structural, social, and symbolic. While fully Portuguese, their histories and experiences are rarely reflected in school curricula, public narratives, or national commemorations. Our national path engages with four main thematic axes: the Carnation Revolution as a peaceful transition, the topic that I have covered, the legacy of colonialism and post-colonial migration, the role of memory and public commemorations, and the use of archives and non-formal education to confront racism and the far right. On the legacy of the Portuguese colonialism, it's important not to forget the specific nature of the Portuguese colonialism, particularly under the Estado Novo regime, as I mentioned earlier. In Portugal, the transition to democracy also meant the end of the colonial empire, triggering a redefinition of relationships with former colonies. In many cases, independences were followed by civil wars. And during this period, Portugal's population increased substantially, particularly due to the return of the retornados. What we know from the most recent statistical indicators, 1.4 million people in Portugal have a migratory background, mostly concentrated in the Lisbon metropolitan area and also in the south in Algarve. People with a migratory background report stronger ties to Portugal than to their family country of origin or their own birthplace. The likelihood of a person from an ethnic minority being among the poorest 20% is almost twice as high as for a white person. Unemployment among ethnic minorities is 90%, nearly 3 times higher than the 7% recorded among the white population. And only 44% of ethnic minorities own their home, compared to 75% among white individuals. In 2023, more than 1.2 million people in Portugal experienced discrimination, and around 500,000 were targeted specifically because of their race, skin color, or ethnic background. These findings highlight structural patterns of exclusion that disproportionately affect Roma communities, Black people, and mixed background. Discrimination is also more frequently reported by women and young people, and also by people with a migratory background. On the role of memory and public commemorations, the 50th anniversary of the Carnation Revolution is being marked by a national commemorative program created by the Portuguese government, an official narrative. The program has gone through 2 distinct phases shaped by the profiles of its commissioners. The first phase was marked by a more civic and artistic and cultural approach, aiming at public engagement. And the second one has tended towards academic historicization with a focus on marking key events and producing more traditional historiographical content. Nevertheless, it's important to note that colonial and post-colonial dimension has emerged clearly in this context, particularly through the lens of the independence process and the role of key liberation leaders like Amílcar Cabral. On the use of archives and non-formal education to confront racism and far right, our main objective is to share and learn from national experiences that promote democratic literacy, especially those that connect archival sources or cultural heritage more broadly with non-formal education. We are particularly interested in exploring how civic and political participation by young people can be stimulated outside conventional mechanisms. There's some projects that we'll try to speak about in our events in Portugal. We'll host 2 public events, one national event in Leiria. We have a house museum there in the center of the country, and an international one in Lisbon, hopefully in April next year, close to the celebrations of the Carnation Revolution. We'll run workshops, youth-led discussions, and visits to memory sites, and we'll try to partnership with schools, NGOs, and youth organizations. We are celebrating 50 years of democracy in Portugal. What has changed since the Carnation Revolution? How has Portuguese society evolved in a half century of freedom and democratic rule? That's the question. Here's a brief portrait of Portugal, a snapshot of the profound social transformation since the Carnation Revolution. We highlight here some indicators regarding health, education, science, and housing and social living condition. And yet, even as we celebrate, we face the decline of democracy across the world. In Portugal, we witness the rising discrimination against foreign nationals, welfare chauvinism targeting specifically migrants, housing exclusions affecting the youngest, and the unprecedented rise of the far right, extreme right in the parliament, with the party Chega, the radical right, the far right party in Portugal, securing the second place in this month election and winning 58 out of 230 seats in the Portuguese parliament. That is why we believe that unarchiving democracy is not simply about memory, it is about reclaiming history and memory as instruments of freedom and of the future. I will end this presentation by recalling Mário Soares' words in the book Portuguese and European, which serves as a motto and inspire the Portuguese participation in this project. If there is a democratic deficit, let's demand more democracy at the level of the institutions and a deeper participation of the citizens. Let's avoid fatalism, disbelief, and desertion. Let's shake it all off. Let's have the courage to assume our responsibilities within our limited sphere of action. With courage, the most important word in politics today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Felipe.
Thank you.
Very, very impressive. Any questions to Felipe at the Portuguese Path?
Yeah, that's our contacts. If you want to take a ride with Mário Soares.